Hello, everybody. Welcome to another live stream for the History Valley podcast. Today, Dr. Robert M. Price joins me to discuss the secret Gospel of Mark. So, there are some scholars that do think that this gospel is entirely authentic. And some of them will even go as far as claiming that this gospel dates even earlier than the Gospel of Mark. And they view it as some sort of proto Mark in this case, an earlier, less developed version of canonical Mark. But many others will say that the one that discovered this, Martin Smith, had fabricated it himself. What are your thoughts on this, Dr. Price?
I find myself in an odd position. I think it's probably a hoax perpetrated by the mischievous Morton Smith, but I hope it's not, because if it is a genuine ancient document, and even if it's the part of the original version of Mark, that would fit into my theories so well that I'm very tempted to think it's true. But of course, that's not sufficient reason for thinking that it is. So I'm still kind of up in the air on it. I suspect it's not genuinely ancient, much less genuinely Markan, but I hope it is. So, and you can't argue it both ways. So I don't feel too bad whichever whether heads or tails comes up.
If it turned out to be genuinely authentic, what are the implications of this?
Well, that it wouldn't necessarily mean what Morton Smith said he thought it would mean, namely that it's a window into an early mystical, libertine, Gnostic version of Christianity. It might mean that, but it's kind of equivocal and sort of skimpy, so it's hard to know. You could take it that way, based on the idea of the baptismal nakedness as part of this nocturnal initiation into the mystery of the kingdom of God, which is what Smith sees as happening in the story, that the death and resurrection of the young man is really kind of symbolic for anybody's rebirth through baptism. That you could take it to mean that with or without any kind of super mystical, much less homoerotic implication that Smith saw in it. Now, this is assuming that he is interpreting a work that he did not create. He might be over-interpreting it in that case, but if he did create it, you could say, well, it means whatever he wants it to mean, and he did take it to be a kind of a pointer to a libertine, mystical Christianity. But I'm not sure that it says that very clearly. It could just be about baptism, and it would fit in very nicely to the two other seemingly related scenes in Mark, where a young man, a neoniskos, clothed only in a linen sindon, a linen winding sheet or whatever, narrowly escapes arrest in the Garden of Gethsemane, leaving the sheet behind. And the empty tomb scene, where a young man, it doesn't say angel, who is now again dressed in a linen sheet, proclaims the knowledge that Jesus is not dead. The tomb is empty, and he is risen, or whatever that means, ascended or alive again, or woke up from a faint, who knows. But if you say that there was this third appearance of the same character, then that begins to make it look like clothing is being used as a symbol for discipleship, and how as one of the disciples, he lost his discipleship when he fled the arrest and left the garment behind, but now he's regained it, sort of like Peter in the Gospel of John. So that's kind of interesting and would make some sense, but not necessarily what Smith thought it meant. Now, let's see. The other implication that I find really fascinating is a theory that Stefan Hermann Huller came up with in a. I think I published this somewhere along the line, an appendix to a book that he never got around to publishing. It had to do with Secret Mark, and in it he says he thinks that it was originally part of Mark, and that the Carpocratian Gnostics used it, as the letter ostensibly from Clement to Theodore says, and that Stefan also says he thinks, because of the way Salome is mentioned in the secret gospel text, that it's kind of like a scene in the Gospel of Basilides, where Jesus is having a dialogue, a revelatory dialogue with Salome. And could it be that we're talking about different quotes from the same esoteric gospel? And this has, and I know this is all very iffy and connect the dots, but nonetheless, this is what I find intriguing, that Huller says he's willing to bet that the Gospel of Basilides, which we don't have otherwise, but we read that there was such a thing, was the same as the Gospel according to the Egyptians, where you find this Jesus-Salome dialogue, and that was the same as the Gospel of Mark. Now, what that would imply is that Basilides was the real Mark, that he's the one that wrote the whole thing, of which we now see a hitherto censored part. Then Huller says it must have come into the hands of Polycarp when Marcellina, a Carpocratian teacher, went to Rome, as we know she did, and where she would have met Polycarp, who was a great opponent of Marcion. Presumably, he would have gained the Gospel of Mark in this longer form from Marcellina. And that would explain why it does not appear in its complete form in our canon, which was originally put together by Polycarp. That he was the ecclesiastical redactor, to borrow Bultmann's phrase, explaining who edited the Gospel of John to hide its original Gnostic character. And that would imply that Polycarp was the one who augmented the Marcionite Gospel into our Gospel of Luke, and that Polycarp may have added anti-Marcionite material to Matthew, which is why we have Jesus in his keynote speech saying, now don't go thinking that I came to abolish the scriptures, that is the law and the prophets. That's not Paul we're talking about, that's Marcion. Paul never says the scriptures are abolished. And so to me, this fits together in so intriguing a way to fit into this pattern of orthodox sanitation of the Gospels that wound up in the canonical New Testament at the hands of its compiler, Polycarp. I realize this is very, very iffy. It's speculative to the nth degree, but these are what I think may be the implications if it is a genuinely ancient piece of Mark's gospel. Sorry to take so long with that.
Oh no, I thought it was wonderful. We got a super chat here from Elias Almudi. It is authentic. It is the gospel which was paralleled by Petronius in the window of Ephesus story. It also explains everything about Mark's gospel.
Yeah, in the Satyricon, you have the story where this woman is mourning her husband in the tomb, and I believe a Roman centurion comes along for some reason and asks her what's the matter, and she's there to starve herself to death to be with her dead husband. And he says, look, there's more to life. Your life is not over. And they share a meal there, and she's feeling the joie de vivre again, and she starts getting frisky with the soldier who has been posted to watch over the body of a crucified felon not far from the tomb. But while he's in there frolicking with the merry widow, somebody comes and steals the criminal's body off the scaffold, and once he gets done with his fun with the woman, he goes out and sees, oh my God, they've stolen the body. I was in charge of it. I'm gonna get killed now. And the woman, who's now in love with the guy, says, well, maybe we could take my late husband's body and put that on the cross. Who'll know the difference? And so the result is an empty tomb and a switcheroo with the body. I'm not sure how that would be read as a parody, but it is an intentionally funny story. So I guess it's a parody of something.
What are the major differences between the Gospel of Mark and Secret Mark?
Well, the absence in canonical Mark of the dialogue, or the would-be dialogue, with Salome, because of course once she shows up, she wants to speak with Jesus and he rebuffs her, so we don't know what they would have said. But that scene is gone, whatever it was, and the scene of the nocturnal resurrection of the rich young man from a garden tomb, that's not there, though there is a rich young man, the famous rich young ruler in Mark, and it kind of looks like an early version of the Lazarus story in the Gospel of John. But other than that, as far as we know, the rest of the gospel, the rest of the secret gospel that matches conventional Mark, as far as I know, there's no real difference in wording. But again, we don't have the rest of it, so who knows? It's just that Clement, if it was really he, doesn't call attention to any other significant differences, and that's as far as we can go.
Where do you lean towards right now? Do you think it is a fabrication, if not by Morton Smith, but by someone else?
I tend to think so. There's a kind of a striking circumstantial case that one can make, partly forensically. What's the guy's name? Stephen Carlson, I think, wrote a book. He's a forensic scientist, not a New Testament scholar, but that's just what you need here. He said, looking at the color photographs of the letter collection that Smith found and claimed to have discovered this snippet from Secret Mark that someone had copied onto end papers in this later book. Carlson said, it looks as if this was not simply transcribed by like a regular biblical scribe looking at the original and copying it down as he went, because that would have had a certain flow to it, whereas it looks like from the blotting intervals and so on that someone was drawing the letters to make it look as it did, not just freely copying it so it was legible. And he said that implies somebody is forging this. I don't know what that proves, but it does look a little odd. Other scholars, I think it was Henri Puesch, Puesch, I think it is, a Belgian scholar. When Morton Smith first published this, just by luck, recently someone had published a work, kind of a catalog of Clement of Alexandria's typical vocabulary. How many times does he use so-and-so word? And it goes through every stinking word in the voluminous surviving writings of Clement and shows how frequently he used them. And naturally, vocabulary statistics are very important in analyzing authorship. And he said when you compare the brief little text of Secret Mark, you come up with this catalog, you come up with an odd result. You might think, well, there's not going to be enough distinctive Clementine material. Now, not just in the Secret Mark part of it, right? But the whole surrounding letter body where Clement is telling his friend Theodore, now I know some say this, some say that, we don't let everybody see this, etc., etc. In the uniquely Clementine part, he compares the vocabulary there with this register of the standard vocabulary of Clement of Alexandria. He says it's like too Clementine. It's as if someone were writing a pastiche of Clement and said, now, I want to really make this sound like him, so I don't want to put my synonyms in there, how I would say it. How would he say what I want him to say? Oh, he'd use this word, that's for sure, and then this one and that one. But it's like caked with them. It's too solid. It's more than you would find in any comparable sample of undisputed Clementine text. He says, who would do this and why? Well, it's obvious they're trying too hard to make it look like Clement. This makes sense to me because, as you may know, I'm a fanatic for H.P. Lovecraft and certain other writers from the 20s and 30s. And I know that, I have tried to write stories that read like Lovecraft, and a lot of people have over the decades. And you can kind of tell when somebody is laying it on too thick. And you wait a minute, all right, Lovecraft liked this word and that word, but he didn't overuse them like this. And it's like a kind of a clumsy attempt. And Puesch said, I think that's who I'm talking about, that it looks like somebody was trying too hard to make it look like Clement of Alexandria. Otherwise, it just wouldn't read this way. And I have to admit that seems a powerful argument. So I don't know. I mean, it's not definitive. But then somebody else, can't think of his name, wrote a long and intriguing book saying, if you know enough about Morton Smith, you begin to pick up on things in the secret gospel that are almost dead giveaways. For instance, the idea that Smith understands the nocturnal initiation of the young man as being some kind of ritual homosexuality. Well, what do you know? In fact, Morton Smith was militantly gay, and though an Episcopal priest, harbored great bitterness toward the Episcopal Church for its anti-homosexual stance back in the 50s. Of course, it's different today. You practically have to be gay to be ordained there, but back then, oh no, very different. And it would make sense if he's trying to embarrass the church that from which he felt he was an outcast. Then you find out that Morton Smith was part of a group of high church gay Anglicans at Cambridge who all felt that they were called the Uranian Society. They felt that the love between men was purer than that between male and female and despised women. and that these people, all ecclesiastics, used to write parodies of scripture. The more you read about this, you think, this sounds like they're describing Morton Smith. And there's yet more to it, little puns in names he gives and so on. You can't really prove it, but I have to admit, it sounds pretty convincing to me, and yet I hope it is genuine. So somebody help me.
You think it's so you currently lean that Morton did it himself?
I think so, but Stephen Huller, for instance, says that is out of the question, and he seems to know more about the background, so I hope he's right. But from what I've heard, there's serious doubt.
I'm going to see if I can get him and you together on my channel.
Yeah.
I would definitely love to have you guys talk about Secret Mark.
Oh, yeah, I'd love that. Yeah. Yeah, Huller really is a genius. He's amazing, this guy. His imagination, his grasp of all these sources and of the languages, he's amazing.
If it turned out to be authentic, when would you date it?
Well, I guess I'd have to default back to the factors that make me think Mark, period, was written in the mid-2nd century.
You would think that canonical Mark and secret Mark would have been written close to the same time?
Well, yeah, if this theory, if it's authentic, it is Mark. And the canonical Mark would be a kind of Bowdlerized edition of it. Subsequent, like a second edition by people that wanted to censor parts of it.
So, in other words, canonical Mark is a redaction of secret.
That's what I would think if Huller and Crossan and others are right. I mean, Crossan and I believe Helmut Kester both say, "Oh yeah, it's original Mark," and I believe Crossan says that material from it has been broken up and redistributed within Mark, which is kind of interesting. But that's, I mean, these guys are no dummies, that's for sure. That doesn't mean they're right, but it does kind of make you think twice before saying, oh, this is just crackpot stuff. I wouldn't be too quick to say that.
Do you think there was an an Mark or other proto Marks that preceded secret Mark?
It wouldn't surprise me, but I don't know, because there are things in, like, one way of explaining the agreements of Matthew and Luke against Mark is to say that they were working from an earlier version of Mark. And I've said this a million times, but one thing that makes me think that is the statement of Jesus before the Sanhedrin when they ask him if he's the Messiah, the Son of the Blessed. And in Matthew and Luke, he answers with an equivocation. Like to Pilate or to the Sanhedrin, you say that I am. Well, what does that mean? Are you or aren't you? I mean, is this your claim or what? Let's see. Whereas in Mark, which they both supposedly used, he says, I am. Now, tell me, please, how Matthew and Luke would have thought, gee, you know, that's not good enough to have Jesus forthrightly confess that he is the Messiah. Nah, I think I'll tone it down to an ambiguous, equivocal evasion. No, I can't believe that. And when you find out that there are 2 or 3 old manuscripts of Mark where he doesn't answer, I am, he says, rather, you say. Well, to me, that just says, okay, that's what Mark originally said. And he was equivocating, and that's what Matthew and Luke read. But some copyists decided to make Jesus more forthright and changed it in Mark but not in the others. So I think at least to that degree, there must have been an earlier version. Another thing, these Markan sandwiches, where you have the beginning of one story and then another one right in the middle, and then you go back to the original, and you can usually tell that they've been stuck together like this to make each story a comment on the other half. Brilliant. Why does Matthew not do that? In Matthew, the stories are not intercalated or imbricated or whatever you want to call it. You have one and then the other. The woman with the issue of blood and then Jairus's daughter, whereas in Mark, the one was put inside the other. What happened? Did Matthew have some reason to undo what Mark did? That seems odd to me. So I've always wondered, was he working from some version of Mark where an editor had not yet put the stories together? And so that's an earlier version. Or one other one, Luke is missing one of these lists of miracles that Jesus did. So that he's only got one feeding of the multitude and one sea miracle and so on and so on. Well, in canonical Mark, you've got them almost side by side in almost the same order, these analogous miracles. Sure enough, Matthew has it that way, but Luke is missing one of those whole sequences. Now, did he figure, look, I got a lot of other stuff to add. This seems redundant. I think I'm going to have to snip it out. He might have. That makes sense. But you have to wonder, was he working with another different version of Proto-Mark that didn't have it, and that some later scribe saw another version of this list of miracles and said, well, it's not exactly the same. I mean, he's feeding 4,001 and 5,000, and I better put them both in. That wouldn't surprise me. So yeah, there is reason to think there might have been various earlier versions of Mark that are reflected in the other synoptics, but who knows?
What do you think about the free document hypothesis, which argues that Luke used Q and Matthew and Mark? Matthew used Mark and Q, but Mark also used the Q document.
To me, the big problem there is, why would certain major things be left out? Like if you take the theory that Mark just used Matthew and Luke and cut out everything that didn't agree. What? I mean, that's ham-handed editing. You mean he didn't figure the Sermon on the Mount was worth putting in because he wasn't sure whether he wanted to use Matthew's version or Luke's version? That seems crazy to me. If you want to get rid of Q by hook or by crook, so you say, well, the stuff that is common to Matthew and Luke is there because Matthew got it from Luke. Or the other way around. Luke got the stuff he has in common with Matthew from Matthew. Well, you're not really solving a problem there, because even though you've eliminated the need for a hypothetical source Q, you've just put the shoe on the other foot, because now what was L or what was M? Aren't you just nominating a different hypothetical source document that doesn't survive? I'm not sure what the advantage of that is. Plus, what about the nativity stories? What would Luke have had? What problem would he have had with Matthew's, or vice versa? I don't get it. I don't see a decent argument for why anybody would have bothered to change it and come up with something else.
We got a super chat here from Reg. Thank you for the super chat. He says, sorry if this has been answered already. What do you think of Litwa's argument that Secret Mark is answering a modern question? Who is the naked man?
Well, Yeah, that would fit in with a possible reason for Smith fabricating it, but I would say it's not explicit enough. Now, I just said before, if the audience managed to stay awake that long, that in a way it does give an added clue that if the young man in white is the same one who flees away naked in Gethsemane and the one who greets the women at the empty tomb, then you might say that the one in Secret Mark is the link between them, and it's trying to use him as a kind of personification of failed but recovered discipleship. But I realize that's kind of lame. I mean, it doesn't really tell you much. Yeah, in fact, you don't really need it to make that point. So if it were an attempt to explain who it was, it doesn't do much by way of explaining. I mean, you could say, well, that's this guy's claiming to be that character. Mark is claiming to have been an eyewitness. That's an old favorite of a fundamentalist apologist nature. And it could be true, but what's it worth? Does it really shed any light on that problem? But again, I've not read what Litwa says about that. I have great regard for him. He may have an excellent argument for it.
What do you think Clement of Alexandria is referring to when he's quoting a particular gospel? Because some people argue that Clement of Alexandria did reference the secret gospel of Mark, but since you lean towards the secret gospel of Mark was fabricated, what do you think he was talking about instead?
What does he say other than the text Morton Smith provided? Is there some other place in his known writings?
Not that I remember right now.
He does speak of secret traditions from the apostles and doesn't say what they are. So it wouldn't be, it's in no way implausible that he would have had access to other gospels for only for the eyes of the Illuminati. That's completely believable.
Do you think that Morton Smith had the motive to fabricate it?
Yeah, this argument that he and his college buddies liked to write scriptural satires, and that they wanted to get even with the homophobic slant of the church in their day, that would really be adequate motivation as far as I can see. I mean, that doesn't prove that's what was at work, but once you know that he felt that way, you got to take a second look at it. So he would have had the motive. And somebody has pointed out, I forget whom, that Smith, in his other work about Jesus and early Christianity, for instance, Jesus the Magician, he doesn't appeal to this. He doesn't make it a building block for any historical Jesus theory, which could be read as a way of saying he didn't want to really commit fraud, like that he might have simply been throwing out the apple of discord to see if his fellow scholars could detect the joke. But that wouldn't mean he would start saying, oh, I've got new evidence for my theory about Jesus. That would really have been fraud. And he, no matter how you cut it, he didn't do that. But others have made hay out of it, but legitimately. I mean, what Crossan and Kester and others say is all quite legitimate theorizing.
What do you think of the argument that Matthew and Luke did not use Mark at all, but they all used hypothetical documents?
Well, in a way, that's just pushing the problem back a step. Like they first came up with the notion of gospel interdependence because like in Schleiermacher's day, for instance, they tended to believe all the Gospels were based on oral tradition. And Schleiermacher thought that sometimes the differences between one Gospel and another had to do, as ridiculous as this sounds now, to whether a particular disciple saw the whole scene or just part of it. Like, I don't know if this was one of his or not, but fundamentalist harmonists, for instance, if they're trying to say, uh-oh, look at this, in Mark and Luke, there's one demoniac in Gerasa, but in Matthew, there's two of them. Uh-oh, what do we do with that? And so some fundamentalists said, well, maybe they're all based on different eyewitness accounts, and one of the eyewitnesses was seeing double that day, or two of them just couldn't see past the crowd of disciples and only saw one. This seems absurd, but that was what you were forced into if you wanted to say, oh, they're all eyewitnesses. It's not completely comprehensive. You do need to put them together, but they're all eyewitnesses. Well, eventually scholars said, even so, that wouldn't explain the verbal accuracy of it. Would they all have remembered it word for word like this? I mean, basically word for word, especially since when they do differ, it kind of looks like somebody is trying to correct an earlier source or to change it. It's not that they just remembered it differently. This view is making a comeback under the theory of what is Milman Parry and Albert Lord, who tried to, they were using Homeric scholarship, which was trying to show that all that the Iliad and the Odyssey could have been composed by a single bard, Homer, because most scholars at the time were saying these must be compilations of several different epics. And they were trying to say, well, not because it's too long. And they would go with tape recorders to coffee shops in the Balkans where there would be these balladeers who would entertain the crowd by reciting hugely long folk epics. And they said, oh, well, all right, I guess the Gospels could have been the same thing. But if you take a close look at that, it really proves the opposite, that they didn't come up with it verbatim every time. But nonetheless, that has made a comeback. But I just don't see how you can, well, they said that, yeah, that would account for verbatim memorization. It just turns out they're wrong. That's not the case. But beyond that, all of the little subtle changes that redaction criticism depends upon, of which there are patterns. I mean, look at Conselman and people like this and how they have shown the intricate patterns of differences between Mark and Luke, for instance. If you're going with the oral tradition thing purely, you have to just ignore all that. Oh, it's just accident. No. These began as written documents. Now, there may have been oral tradition behind them, but our documents are based on some early written deposit that the other evangelists have changed and rewritten.
When looking at Basilides, what is it about him that gives Stephen Huller the impression that his theology is very Markan?
Which one? Whose theology?
Basilides.
Oh, yeah. I'm sorry. I think it's the baptism story where it says, unlike Matthew and Luke, that where it says the Spirit descended upon Jesus. In Mark, it says the Spirit entered into Jesus. And that sounds very Gnostic. And then toward the end of it, what does Jesus say? My God, why have you forsaken me? Well, that's already a little different in the Gospel of Peter, right? Where Jesus says, my power, why have you left me? And so some of the Gnostics thought, well, you see, this fits perfectly. Jesus of Nazareth was the human channeler for the Christ spirit that entered into him at his baptism. But now his teaching career was done, his revealing career. So the Spirit abandoned him. But don't worry, some Gnostics said, his death on the cross does atone for the sins of the Sukkikoi, the ones that are not, the Illuminati like us Gnostics. But that's what he was talking about. Jesus and Christ weren't the same. And then also, I believe it was Basilides that said, if you look close at Mark, it's not Jesus who is crucified. It says they beat him and all of this, and they took Jesus' cross and yanked some guy out of the crowd, Simon of Cyrene, was coming in from the field, and he carried the cross to the place of crucifixion, and there they crucified him. Well, who was him? Well, Jesus, of course. Not so fast. The pronoun should refer to the last name mentioned, shouldn't it? And that was Simon. So, and of course, there was this theological legend in the early church that it was Simon who was crucified, not Jesus. And the Simonians claimed that it was really Simon who seemed to suffer on the cross. So it's very odd, but there is a way of reading it that suggests a kind of substitutionary evasion of the cross by Jesus, or at least by the Christ Spirit. And so he, plus there's the Salome business. Because if the Gospel of Basilides is the same as the Gospel according to the Egyptians, which has Jesus reclining on the couch as a dinner guest of Salome, and she says something like, when will the kingdom come? And Jesus says, as long as you women bear children, for I have come to destroy the works of the female. Well, that's encretism, right? And that's not quite as weird as it sounds. And Stephan says that why is Salome mentioned in the secret gospel if it is not for her to ask further questions of the Savior, but she's had her chance. We don't know why he rebuffs her, but he does with his own mother, right, in the same gospel. So not that odd.
We got another super chat from Reg again. Thank you for another super chat. Clement also mentions the teachings of Matthias. Are texts attached to marginal figures more likely to hold authentic traditions?
I don't know. I've wondered about that. It would make sense, but on the other hand, it might be that by this time all the big names were taken. There's so many things attributed to Matthew and Peter and so forth. It might have been, who's going to believe they said something else that's different? Maybe we ought to attribute it to someone to whom nothing else is attributed. And so, we can make a go of this. But you could say just the opposite, that these are esoteric teachings, that everybody's trumpeting, oh, Simon Peter said this and Mary said that. But did you know what Matthias said? No, I didn't think so, because it was only to a chosen few. And so it could be a part of that motif. Like in the Gospel of Thomas, these are the secret sayings that the living Jesus spoke and that Didymus Judas Thomas wrote down. And then later on, Matthias is said to have written down what somebody else heard Jesus say. So it might be a way of saying, never heard of this, did you? Well, I'm not surprised. Now you're going to hear about it, though.
What do you think about the argument that some scholars make that Mark, the Gospel of Mark, was familiar with the Gospel of Thomas?
I don't really see that. I mean, maybe there's something. I mean, I'm sure there's things I've never noticed, but it sounds much more like other Gospels. Like it almost sounds like the Gospel of John with the all the limitations removed, where Jesus says these I am statements like, I am the all came forth from me. Holy mackerel. I mean, that's like Jesus saying stuff that about himself that Colossians says. I mean, that is really stunning material. And so there's all kinds of stuff that doesn't sound much like any of the synoptics, but then there are other things that sound so much like them that scholars argue that I bet these were even earlier versions of some of the parables. But I don't really see that. It could be true, but my theory is that whoever compiled Thomas parallels canonical gospel sayings closely, but not too closely, simply because he did not have written copies to consult and is quoting from memory from gospel passages he's heard read in church, which is why he doesn't have Matthew's parable interpretations. It's a lot easier to remember the parable than the word for word pedantic explanation. And so I tend to think, yeah, it sounds a lot like it, not because it's independent, but because somebody's memory has boiled it down to the essentials. So it's like re-entered the stream of oral tradition.
What do you think of the Deutero-Mark hypothesis?
What is that? I'm not familiar with the phrase.
It's a different way of looking at redactions in Mark, that Mark was written over a long period of time. I think it's almost like a documentary hypothesis for Mark.
Could be. I mean, I admit that things could be a lot more complicated than any theory I toy around with. I guess I just feel like it's Occam's razor. Reality is often very complicated, and so complicated that we can never really hope to untangle it. And so we're stuck saying the one that can be explained most simply is probably the best one. But that doesn't mean it's true. Like I always say that if the old fundamentalist daydream came true and you died and went to heaven and there's the angel explaining everything in a huge seminar and say, oh, me next. What was the answer to this? Did Mark use different sources? I can't help thinking Professor Angel would say, you don't have the beginnings of an idea. Let me explain to you. Let's go to the chalkboard. And there would be some fantastically complicated thing we never would have thought of. So, among the candidates, I tend to go with the one that seems simplest and makes the most sense without too many contrivances. But it could all be contrivance. Who knows how complex the facts are?
What do you think of the claim that John's gospel is first, and that the synoptic gospels made use of John?
It seems unlikely to me because there are passages in John that sound to me like corrections of passages in the synoptic gospels, or sometimes just instances where John is copying and grew or whoever he was, and grew absent-minded and said, "Oh, I meant to stop before that." Like when he's talking about in the Last Supper discourse, the fact that people will persecute them, thinking that they're doing a service to God. And then he keeps going about missionary instructions, which really are off the topic completely. And then it abruptly stops and gets back on the subject. That kind of looks to me like somebody is using some version of one of the synoptics, but a bit clumsily, or corrections. You know, I mentioned this thing where in John chapter 12, the voice from heaven says, "I have glorified my name and I'm about to do it again." And it said that the bystanders heard it, but misconstrued it. Some thought it was a thunderclap. Others thought it was the voice of an angel. And it starts out with Jesus saying, "Well, I'm very sorrowful now, but what do you expect me to try to get out of this? No, that's why I came to this." That sounds to me like this is a correction of Luke, where Jesus is really upset, and you have the sweat drop falling to the ground like great drops of blood, and he does ask to escape his fate, but is willing to go along with it. And an angel comes and strengthens him, just like Elijah. Well, to me, John is trying to refute all that by saying, you might think I'm going to say, "Let me get out of this," but no way, I'm not doing it. He's refuting Luke. And then, was there an angel involved to strengthen him? No, he didn't need to be strengthened or encouraged. Some idiot may have thought he heard something like that, but no, he didn't. And so to me, that sounds like that John is correcting Luke. And the same thing with who carried Jesus' cross to Golgotha. Matthew, Mark, and Luke. It was Simon of Cyrene. It doesn't say Jesus was too weak and dropped the cross halfway there. That's what we always hear in church, but it just says no. They grabbed Simon and he carried it to Golgotha. Not in John, though, right? There's no Simon of Cyrene. Jesus carries the cross the whole way. Why? Well, obviously, because John knows that Jesus supposedly said, "Whoever would be my disciple, let him take up his cross and follow me." Whoa, that's a goodie. That is one of the great gospel sayings. But you mean Jesus didn't carry his own cross? No, I can't have that in the story. I have to have Jesus carry the cross. So in my version, he does. And so I think you've got signs that the fourth evangelist knew the other gospels, and usually used them as a framework, though he redid a lot of stuff, but that at certain points he corrected them and said, "No, this can't be."
So here's my final question for the stream. Are we told anywhere by any church father, any Christian text at all, that Basilides wrote the Gospel of Mark?
I don't think so. I know there are similar theories that some thought that Cerinthus wrote the Gospel of John, or that Marcion smuggled in some Marcionite material between things John dictated, but I don't believe there's any patristic criticism of Mark that would have involved Basilides in it. But then again, what information do we have about any of them? Where even when we think that Papias is telling us that Matthew wrote this gospel and Mark wrote that one, way back in the 19th century, David Friedrich Strauss said, we're not even sure that Papias is talking about the books we consider to be by Mark and Matthew, because there were others. There was the infancy gospel of Matthew and the various Hebrew gospels that are apparently supposed to be versions of him. Who knows? So we don't really know that much about any of them. So it wouldn't. I think internal evidence is all we have, but you can only push it so far. I admit, I'm the first to admit that what Stephen Huller says about Basilides as the author is speculative. I just find that it makes a lot of sense to me, and that's as far as I go with it.
Well, thanks for joining me today, Dr. Price. And we will return tomorrow to discuss different translations of the Bible, including scholarly criticism of the NIV translation.
Oh, yeah. That'll be great fun. Sure appreciate your having me on to do these things.
Hello, viewers. Thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during a live stream. Thank you.